The Kalb Report is funded by a grant from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is the Kalb Report with Marvin Kalb.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and our topic tonight, Truth Be Told, Journalism in the Age of Donald Trump. In February 2017, 3 weeks after his inauguration, President Trump called the press the enemy of the American people. If truth be told, our mission tonight, I was stunned. He was the first leader of a democracy to call the press an enemy of the people. Up to this time, only the dictators of the 20th century, Hitler of Germany, Stalin of the Soviet Union, had used that loaded phrase. I was left wondering, why would Trump choose to join such unsavory company? What did he have in mind? What was his strategy? And for a journalist, equally important, how should one cover a president so indifferent to historical fact and so free and easy with truth? No easy task. And I've invited 4 experienced and knowledgeable reporters to help us understand the current collision between the president and the press. To my right, a matter of geography, not politics, my old friend and colleague Ted Koppel, one of America's most distinguished journalists. For 43 years, he worked at ABC News, for 25 of them as anchor of Nightline. He's covered wars and politics, won every award, and now contributes to CBS Sunday Morning. To my left, again geography, Brian Stelter, senior media correspondent for CNN and host of Reliable Sources, a program that examines top media stories every Sunday. Before joining CNN in 2013, Stelter was a media correspondent for the New York Times. To my immediate right, David Folkenflik, media correspondent for NPR. On a weekly basis, he hosts On Point, an NPR program of analysis and commentary. He was a reporter at the Baltimore Sun before joining NPR in 2004. And to my left, an old friend, Emily Rooney, a radio and television talk show host at WGBH, the PBS station in Boston. Once a week, she does a program facetiously called Beat the Press. She has also worked for Fox and ABC. So, welcome everybody. It is no surprise to any of you, I know, that at the top ranks of journalism today, there is a split, a clear difference of opinion about how to cover President Trump. On one side is the view, represented here by Ted Koppel and others, that reporters should continue to do their job objectively, professionally, and avoid any skirmish with the president. No matter what he says, just do your job. But on the other side, recently articulated by Chuck Todd of NBC, is the view that journalists, of course, should continue to do their job as professionally as possible and stay focused. But if the president or his supporters continue to rip into the press, accuse reporters of peddling fake news, of being enemies of the people, they should, as Chuck Todd said, fight back. But how? By proving, he said, that their reporting was accurate, a fair rendition of reality and not fake news, and, if necessary, to call a lie a lie. So, Ted, taking all of that into account, What is your underlying fear about this collision between president and press?
Well, let me tell you a little anecdote, which, as our old friend Henry Kissinger liked to say, has the additional advantage of being true. In Cleveland, the day that he was nominated, I sat down with Donald Trump. I have known Donald Trump for about 20 years. And in the course of that interview, he said to me, you know, Ted, I don't need you guys anymore. You guys in the press. He said, I've got, I think at that time it was 18 million followers on Twitter, and perhaps at that point 12 million followers on Facebook. Those numbers have expanded.
Going up to about 53 million.
Hugely. He said, I don't need you guys. I can contact my people directly, communicate with them directly. That's part of our problem. The other part of our problem is the internet, which, because it gives access to anyone with an iPhone or a laptop computer, requires far less experience than any of the panelists you have up here. Anyone with an outlook and the ability to go online can spread the word, whatever that word may be. So you have two things: a president who really understands how to circumvent the media and how to use social media as a means of activating his base, and a base which in turn is capable of communicating with one another in a fashion they've never been able to do before.
Absolutely true. And yet, he is the sort of president who leans on the press, who does want coverage, who is involved in a very real way in trying to court the press at the same time as he attacks the press. Brian, from your standpoint, which of those two schools would you join up with, the Koppel school or the Todd school?
I don't know how apart they really are, but I think the press is fighting back and has to fight back because we are being... Think about what he says on a daily basis. It is a poison. You may love his policies. I may love his policies. But his attacks against the press are a poison. And he is infecting tens of millions of people with that poison. Now, obviously, not everybody has been infected. Not everybody believes this nonsense about the press that he spreads every day. But it is poisonous. And for us to sit there and pretend as if he's not saying it just lets it fester and further divide the country.
But how do you fight back?
By telling the truth more loudly, more forcefully, by saying when he's lying what he's doing. It's not as simple as saying that's a lie, but to try to identify to the public how extreme the rhetoric is, how extreme the dishonesty is. And by the way, at all times, pointing out when he is telling the truth as well, and when his policies are helping people as well. Because this is a very complicated story that we're covering. And I think, for the most part, journalists are trying to be very careful and fair about it. However, let's be clear, there is a lively partisan press, full of opinion, full of hate for the president, full of rage. And that exists very much on the left. And I think that's apart from this conversation about newsrooms trying to get it right. And then, of course, on the right, there is an alternative universe, a partisan press that is propagandistic in support of the president. But I think you're right. He loves the press. He loves engaging with the press. But he wants his fans to hate the press at the same time. He is the leader of a hate movement against the press that we haven't seen before. And I wish I knew exactly what to do about it, but I think having to be louder about the truth feels like part of the answer.
David Folkenflik, Emily Rooney. I would like to ask you, each of you, and I will start with David, and Emily, you're going to bat cleanup. So, but in your judgment, as you listen to this discussion, what is the central issue, the central problem, as you see it, that journalists confront today when covering the president? David, go first.
There are a number of central problems. I think the key one is there's a steady stream of pronouncements from the nation's chief executive that are often, shall we say, at two with the truth, that are alienated from fact, And nonetheless, people are trying to figure out, even now, even this many months into the presidency, how they report this straightforwardly. It's important, it's news when the president says this. I think that we have a sort of split screen moment where we have to report on the substance of the presidency and the administration, and we can't ignore the rhetoric. The rhetoric is part of the message that what the president conveys publicly is very much part of his leadership. That's the way it's the modern era, and it has been since Lincoln, or earlier. But I think that we struggle at times to differentiate between the substance of the presidency, the rhetoric of the presidency, which is important, and also his attacks on the truth and attacks on the press. And so we sometimes conflate these things, or we sometimes take our eye off one of those, the question of the policies, the effects on people, and we tie it all up in what his sentences are, how he addresses us. Sometimes that is the main story, but often it distracts us from what's actually happening throughout the government that's affecting tens of millions of Americans or more. And I think that's one of our main challenges.
Tell me, please, the link that you drew a moment ago between Trump and Lincoln. I didn't quite catch that clearly.
Well, I'm sure he'd be happy to help you make that link. I think that, look, I remember the Reagan presidency. People said this is a television presidency. If you think back to JFK, he sort of introduced the idea of a president commanding a television medium. You guys know this well. FDR and radio. They're people who own the medium, and people talk about Trump as owning social media in the way that some of these folks own different platforms over the years. It seems to me in a different way somehow this is a media presidency, almost conceived of in a TV studio and hatched and played out in the public sphere, yes, but also online and on the air.
Well, he was an NBC star for about 7-8 years, right? In the Apprentice program. What is your view on this, Emily?
Well, I mean, there are just so many outlets now that we're talking about the media coverage. It really depends on who you're watching. You can't just focus on one thing. I mean, I think about how Fox obviously takes it from one perspective. I was at a dinner over the weekend where people are just convinced that CNN takes it in another direction. I'm concerned to some degree how the so-called mainstream media covers it. I don't like it when the New York Times puts an ellipses in a quote instead of using the word pussy. That's what the president said, and I'm sure they have all kinds of debates inside these organizations. I know I had to fight for it on my show, and I said, well, I'm using it. And if somebody up there wants to clip it on me, they can do it, but I'm going to use the word. So I agree with David. We have to, sometimes we don't quote the president enough. There's an incident even today that we won't go into, but that won't make the news because it was televised because it was part of a press conference. But all of these things add up in a way that I agree with Brian, that you can't ignore them. You have to, it's not a question of fighting back. I have to say, Ted, in many ways, I don't even lament the coverage of the past. So much has changed and morphed in the last 25, 30 years since we worked back then together, that it's fascinating in a way, and you gotta be on top of it, whether that means pushing back or just including it as part of the coverage, I'd have to say.
What strikes me is that since Nixon's time, since Spiro Agnew, he was, for those of you young and didn't know that, he was once our vice president. But since Nixon's time, there were two things going on there. There was the president and his group figuring out that if you attack the press, you can actually pick up a few more votes. And second, the people were listening because over time, there was a lowering of popular respect for the media. There was less trust that was placed in the media. We don't like to think about that, but it is a fact when you go to the polls. That is very much true. And the president has come in and he has pushed that very dramatically. In your mind, Ted, aside from using social media, what was the strategy? Do you think he had a strategy? Was he stumbling onto something, or did he really have in mind a way of using the press in order to get his end?
Look, in the old days, we were the gatekeepers. That was a term that a behavioral scientist by the name of Wilbur Schramm coined many, many years ago. To get to the public, you had to go through Marvin Kalb, or Walter Cronkite, or Chet Huntley and David Brinkley. And you only had the 3 networks, right? That made a huge difference. Another quick story. I got a call, about 30 years ago, from a New York Times reporter. No, actually, I called him because I wanted him to come on as a guest on Nightline. And he went to check with the then executive editor of the New York Times, a fellow by the name of Abe Rosenthal, old friend of yours. And he called me back later and he said, I'll tell you what Abe said. He said, you want to go on Koppel's program? You go right ahead. Only don't come back to the New York Times. His point being twofold. One, you work for the Times, and that's all I want you to do. And 2, Koppel's going to ask you a lot of provocative questions. And I don't want my New York Times reporters expressing opinions. Well, them days is long past. From Morning Joe to Rachel at night on CNN, on MSNBC, the spear carriers are there from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, and they are trying very, very hard to be what they are, first-rate objective reporters. But when you are in the presence of Joe and Mika Brzezinski in the morning, and you are on that program where quite clearly the agenda is anti-Trump from start to finish, if you appear on that program and you sit on that desk morning after morning after morning, the public is going to identify you as being anti-Trump. And you can do the best you possibly can to be an objective reporter when you're doing your stories for the Times, and people aren't going to believe you.
And what does one do about that? First of all, Brian, Emily,
Interesting.
At this particular point, you're called on these programs, you're the host of one of them, and you are drawn into a kind of political atmosphere. And the president looks at that and says, they are against me. The president has said, you, the press, are part of the Democratic Party. He sees you as an enemy. And so we can use the phrase, enemy of the people. And in his mind, that might be justifiable. But in a reporter's mind, what should the reporter be doing? Is he trapped? Is there a way out? What?
You first?
Oh, go ahead.
No, come
I was
on.
hoping he called on both.
Okay.
Look, every day, I mean, we are quite a ways into this presidency, and yet every day I find myself trying to get the tone right, trying to get the tenor right, trying to get the questions right, in a way that broadens and doesn't limit the audience, right? Because the country, many of the problems we're discussing are really problems of the country, polarization of the country, folks feeling left behind or being told they've been left behind. Conservative radio hosts who for 30 years have told you the press hates you and they're out to get you, and they don't. A lot of this, of course, has existed for a long time, and as you said, Trump takes advantage of it. But I find myself every day thinking, okay, I can either try to regain people's trust a little bit today, or I can lose even more trust today. You know, I think every day in every newsroom, journalists can either gain a little more trust or lose a little more trust. And I think you make a very fair point, Ted, about going on these opinion shows and trying your best just to tell the reporting, but in an environment full of opinion. I guess my theory of media is that the cell phone changed everything. Because you have access to the headlines on your phone at all times, and almost everybody has that phone, now TV has to be something different. TV has to be analysis and perspective and opinion. TV has to be more than the headlines. But that does create some really awkward situations for reporters, including myself.
Emily, I'm reminded, one of my old CBS colleagues, a guy who used to cover the UN, Richard C. Hoddle.
Oh, yeah.
He used to tell journalism students, play it straight, don't tell them what you think, don't tell them what you feel, just tell them what you know.
What you know.
That's such an ideal, wonderful phraseology. But are we now so, picking up your point, are we now so politically polarized that the journalist is drawn into not just covering politics, but drawn into politics, so that You become part of it. Is there escape from that?
Well, the interesting thing to me is that for the most part, journalists are not being pulled into the politics. You don't have to be anti-Trump or anti-Trump politics, or even you could be pro if you're a journalist. I actually know some. But it's undeniable, the characterizations of the human being himself, to think that he makes repulsive statements, that he is repulsive in his interactions with a lot of people, that he's bizarre, that he's uncontrolled, that we've heard the word unhinged many times. So journalists use these words because there's truth to them, which has nothing to do with his trade policy or his position on the economy or some of the good things that he's done. And that, to go back to what David Folkenflik was saying earlier, that becomes at least 50% of the conversation. And there is truth to it without putting your opinion about his trade policy.
If I can add one sentence to that, journalists should stand up for truth and decency. We're not standing up for a certain tariff policy, but journalists have to stand up for truth and decency, because if we don't, who is in this world?
Well, when we talk about sort of at a macro level political polarization, and I understand that, and journalists are affected by it. But is it not true also that there is a political polarization taking place within journalism? Donald Trump said recently, I don't know where he got his numbers from, but he said recently that 91% of the press peddles fake news. Only 9%, he said, cover the news straight, and that 9% is Fox News. And in his mind, then, the overwhelming majority of reporters are involved in an anti-Trump operation. And within journalism, there is a split. And people can be in Fox or CNN or MSNBC, and whether they like it or not, they are perceived as part of the political process, which they don't want to be. How do you get out of it? Is it possible?
I mean, I think part of it is looking at what journalists do, and part of it is all of us as citizens, how we evaluate these sources of information. So for me, I think that point of view news organizations, which have existed since the Republic started, can often serve a very useful role and are not simply always polemical. But I look at, does a news organization that has a point of view admit facts against their interest? If you look at Mother Jones, a very left of center publication, they are very sophisticated, hardworking journalists, and by and large, they try very hard to acknowledge facts that might cut against the thesis or the ideology they would seemingly support. Fox News does that less so, fairly glaringly at times, although there is this distinction between news and opinion. It clearly affects what they do in the news program as well. And I think that what we need to do is evaluate conservative and liberal news organizations that take on that avowedly. You're asking, is the pH balance of the water changed by this, so that are we all swimming in ideologically polarized waters, right? And the answer is, I think a lot of very serious news organizations that take on Ted Koppel's outlook, mine among them, try very hard to do things down the middle. Now, I don't think it's partisan. I don't think it's ideological to stand up for a dissection of fact and truth, and to make sure that it's contextualized and present that to the public. I don't think it's partisan. I don't think it's ideological to stand up for transparency as a value. We talk a lot about rhetoric in this administration. We talk far less about transparency in this administration and our understanding of openness in government. I think that Democratic and liberal and conservative and Republican administrations should all be held to the question of how we know what the government is doing in our name and with our tax dollars, so that we can function as citizens and not just consumers of news, right? So these are not partisan values, I think. So there are ways in which you can ostensibly be fighting something when in reality you're standing up for what seem to me to be enduring journalistic principles. I want to add one other thing, which is, in talking with colleagues over the years, and NPR tries very hard to be straight down the middle. We have people from different points of view on the air, but we don't really have commentators, for the network in the way that we once did. And we try very hard to do it, but there is an understanding that we can at times reach what I like to call earned conclusions. They're not ideological, they carry no partisan brief, but the idea is, if you've done the reporting, if you show your homework, if you make your case and test it, if you provide the countervailing evidence that's the strongest case against it, and still there's something that is clearly evidently shown to be true, you share that with your audiences. Now, people may say, well, wait a second, that's an opinion. I'm not advocating opinion. I'm saying that you can reach a kind of earned conclusion built on, a very strong foundation of reporting and journalism.
And Ted, when you're in the White House and you listen to what he's just said, what do you think?
Oh, I think that we've left out a key word. Yeah, everybody here keeps talking about ideology and politics. Money. Money.
Money.
Money. Donald Trump has been very, very good for baseball. He has been wonderful for the industry. Your boss acknowledged as much a number of months ago during the campaign.
Les Moonves.
Donald Trump, huh?
It was Les Moonves who
Les
acknowledged it.
Moonves also acknowledged it, but so did the head of CNN.
But that means
Over 100
what?
million extra.
If ratings are up, that means what?
The ratings are up. It means you can't do without Donald Trump. You would be lost without Donald Trump.
Well, that is what
CNN's
he says.
Hold
Ted,
on
you know
just a
that's not
second.
true.
CNN's ratings would be in the toilet without Donald Trump.
You know that's not true. You're playing for
is.
laughs. You've lived through enough presidencies to know
Hold on a
there
second,
will be more
Brian.
presidents.
What were the ratings before Trump and what are the ratings now?
I would say we might be up 20, we might be up 30%, we might be up 40%. If we go back down 40%, that's okay too.
Well, it may not be okay,
Of
but
course it is. No, but hold on. I reject the premise that these networks are making so much money off of Trump and thus we benefit from it.
Tell me for a moment, if you
There's-
will, let's get away from CNN then, all right? Sensitive subject. No. Let's go to MSNBC. Is there a moment of the day when they are not focusing on Donald Trump or some intimately related subject? It is essentially, I know every once in a while. If the number of people who died in Indonesia gets up to 1,000, they'll give it a mention or two. But by and large, the only news that's covered, program after program after program.
Ted, I have to
with
interrupt.
the same guest.
Ted.
Yes, please.
But you've got to admit an awful lot of what Trump does in the course of a day
Is newsworthy.
news.
Yes, of
And
course
so
it
whether
is.
you're an MSNBC or CBS or ABC,
Right.
you're going to cover him.
Yes.
And what happens after a while is that you become overwhelmed. You're saturated with Trump, and that's pretty much what he wants. And I keep on thinking about how does the journalist deal with this? And I want to take a moment now to advise our viewers, our listeners, readers, that this is the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and I'm discussing the troubled relationship between the president and the press with Ted Koppel, David Folkenflik, Emily Rooney, and Brian Stelter. Brian, I want to pick something up. You're one of those hardworking guys. You're probably in the office 7 days a week.
That's fair. My wife doesn't like me to admit that, but yes, that's true.
No, but what I would like to know from you is, what is the mood in a newsroom these days? Are journalists just excited as can be about covering the president, getting out there, doing this, that, and the other? Or is there another mood? Is there a mood of fear, for example? What is the sense? What do you say?
I think some of the greatest fears of the Trump era have not come to pass, meaning we should give, strange way credit for this. He has not kicked reporters out of the White House. We have not seen mass jailings of journalists. These were true fears after election night in 2016, given the president's awful rhetoric toward the press. I do think there is a sense of concern sometimes at these rallies when he is encouraging the crowd to boo journalists. I am constantly concerned we're going to see some sort of violence at those rallies. But I would point out some of those worst fears have not come to pass. I think for the most part, journalists are rejuvenated. They are energized by covering this story because it is a 24/7 story.
Yeah.
It's a crisis. It's a crisis. You might love the guy, you might hate the guy, but he's come in with a different kind of experience. The government has been dysfunctional in many ways. There are countless untold stories of what's happened in the Trump era that I can't wait to read, that I assume will come out after the Trump presidency. And I think because the phone changed everything, because the web changed everything, it's okay for a news channel to be covering Trump throughout the day. I think that's a logical programming choice when we are living through a crisis. And after Trump, there's going to be a lot of stories to tell also.
Emily, he's just used the word crisis 3 or 4 times. How would you define that word? in the current environment?
You probably disagree with me.
So would you use it at all?
I'm not sure I would say it's a crisis. I mean, you use the word energized, and you asked whether this has energized newsrooms. There is no question that it is energized, but I'm sure like your station, like your network and others, there's a conversation that goes on. I know we have it all the time. Are we going to have a Trump-free Friday? We'll talk about, we do Beat the Press, we do a lot of different issues. And we think about the ratings, even at PBS, of course we do. And is it going to be better for the show or worse for the show to leave him out of it? And some of these things some of the issues get very repetitive. Have people had enough of it? Should we move on to how they covered the tsunami or how they covered the Hurricane Joaquin or something like that? So, but, I mean, you're asking me about the word crisis. I mean, I'd say no. It's another story that has just an edge. You feel like you're always going to the next edge of it.
How about a crisis of credibility?
That would I go
You got
along with.
that?
We can't believe a word he says.
Yeah.
This is a situation have we ever experienced it before?
I don't know. Have you ever been threatened?
Yes, and if CNN and PR were here, they would tell me not to talk about it.
I've seen it on Twitter.
Not supposed to encourage knowledge of it. But yeah, I mean, we had a guy call into C-SPAN and say he would shoot me if he saw me. That was a very public example. I figure, I try to ignore it, try to tune it out. I think women in this industry get a lot worse than I do, and I think minority journalists get a lot worse than I do. But I think it's a consequence of this very polarized climate where journalists are treated as political actors when we're trying not to be, right? If we say President Trump today said 5 things that were bogus, and here's how we know they're bogus, we sound like we're against him. We sound adversarial, when in fact we're literally just trying to tell you what happened today. And I think that's the tension that's in this relationship.
You know, David, that Katie Tur of NBC said on the air that she was threatened with rape if she continued to criticize the president. And I'm wondering, have you personally been threatened in any way?
I would say that on Twitter and sometimes in private messages and Facebook, I've had some pretty hateful things that it's, often, anti-Semitic things that basically are, threatening certain things. They're not explicit murder threats, but, not as vile as some colleagues have
Threaten
had.
your life or simply threaten you in general?
More like you should be, rather than I will.
Killed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Along those lines.
Yeah.
Intimating. Others have gotten far more and far worse.
Right. Now, would you associate that with Trump as president, or is this something that would have happened, you imagine, even without Trump?
I would say, if you're talking about the energizing of newsrooms, that people have felt energized in the country to express vileness and hatefulness in a way that the president has not, either as a candidate or in office, adequately spoken against. I'm not saying it is something that he explicitly encourages, but I do think that both an anti-press rhetoric and certain kinds of vile targeting of journalists in misogynistic, sexist, anti-Semitic, racist ways has been fostered by the president's sort of rather blasé remarks, if at all, about it. It's almost the equivalent of what he did after Charlottesville, where he's saying, well, there are a lot of good people and a lot of bad people in the world. It's a shame if bad things happen to people. Okay, it's a... Well, let me yield. But I wouldn't blame him for it. It's not like, when the now congressman from Montana body slammed a reporter from The Guardian, which is essentially a physical assault for which he was convicted. I don't blame Trump for that.
And then elected, by the way.
Right, the next day, I believe. Or within days. I don't blame Trump for that, but I think he has fostered a climate in which such things are more acceptable now. I don't blame the president at all for what happened not far from here in Annapolis, where a former colleague of mine, friend of mine, and 4 others were killed in the newsroom down there. But I think it's very notable that the president hasn't denounced such rhetoric, even if at times the press does things that he feels bedevil him.
Ted, you and I covered the Nixon administration, and there's always a comparison that is quickly drawn when trying to figure out Trump. They say, well, go back to Nixon. It's pretty much the same thing. What is your sense of, put your mind back to Nixon's time now, and try to find the comparison. Is it a fair link-up, or is there something different about Trump and Nixon?
Of course, there's something different. I mean, first of all, they're different in terms of substance. It's clearly different in terms of the times and the media landscape in which we live. Just for the record, my secretary, when I was doing Nightline, used to gather weekly the letters threatening my bodily welfare and pass them on to the FBI every week. Now, the fact of the matter is that back in those days, people had to type it or write it by hand. These days, it's a lot easier to convey that point of view. And let me just say parenthetically, I do believe that NPR serves as a fine example of how pretty much down the line you can avoid partisanship and avoid giving the impression of partisanship. It's a first-rate news organization, and they cover the news widely. Now, one of the reasons may well be that they are not dependent on the advertising dollar, right? They raise their money in a different fashion. But I'm just saying Donald Trump has been very, very good for the business of broadcasting.
Brian, is Trump good or bad for the quality of journalism now?
That's really interesting, because I do think there's more high-quality journalism now than ever if you know how to find it. The problem is we've moved from this system of it's given to you, it's delivered to you pretty easily. Now you have to go out finding it. You have to search for it. You have to scroll through your Facebook feed or have the right Google News alerts or have the right social networks in order to find the best of the best. But there's so much more journalism being produced these days, including by international outlets, including by nonprofit outlets.
Of a high quality?
That it is of such a high quality that there's more of it. It's just, it can be a pain to find it. And I think that is, I mean, that's the fundamental thing we're reckoning with, that, I think CNN has to be something different in the age of the internet. There are all of these pop-up startups, new outlets that are able to do in-depth reporting that frankly give the CNNs of the world a run for their money.
And Emily, Brian earlier talked about truth and the pursuit of truth. And you could come up with a story that is very true, but extremely negative. And a good chunk of the American people are going to think that you're not telling them the truth. And I'm wondering, we have gone so far into this now. How do you imagine we can, if we can at all, reconstruct an image of the press as honorable, decent people going off to cover the news, and really not part of the political process, not part of the Democratic Party there to attack this good Republican president? Is that at all possible?
You know, we really forget that for decades and decades, the American press has had a problem with being believed. I mean, I was right at ABC right at the time when Vince Foster committed suicide. How many conspiracy theories did we have to go through? How many nights can you remember Sylvia Chase being on that story, getting up there every night and telling the American people what really happened with Vince Foster? He killed himself in a park somewhere near here. But people didn't believe it. There have been others, the Kennedy assassination, as many times as you go back over a story. So this isn't really new to us. And by the way, the whole thing with the Comet Pizza thing, with, that was the pedophile.
Pizzagate.
People reported that story with earnesty about how it wasn't true, but people, they believe what they want to believe. I don't know what to say about that. Do you just give up on those people, or do you try to swing them back? It has gotten to the point where news, and I agree with Brian, there's so many fabulous choices out there, and there's so many millions of choices, just period. People pick their own niche because it's what they agree with. They watch the news that they agree with.
David, does it not end up with conservatives going with Fox, liberals going with MSNBC, and then some of us still down the middle somewhere. So you end up in a political separation, one American group from another American group based upon what they think the journalist is saying, what they feel a network represents. See, I remember a time, and Mr. Koppel will remember a time, when most people, not everybody, but most people, thought we were in the business of providing them with information, not political slant. You got some people saying that, but most people felt we were part of an accepted fact-finding effort that was extremely important.
You mean we nattering nabobs of negativism?
That's right.
Yeah, that's right.
And he said that and was made fun of, and we moved on.
But a whole lot of people applauded at the time.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
I'm just, again, for the younger members of our audience here, that was Spiro Agnew. And Spiro Agnew became a household name by taking on the press,
Yes.
by taking on television.
Yes.
And a great many people in this country, and I think one of the things, you know, this may sound like a strange word to use about us, but I think we need a little more humility. I think we need a little humility about the people who are so frustrated with us that they find themselves turning in desperation to Donald Trump, if for no other reason that he, I don't know if you can say this on the Kalb report, but he pisses us off. And people love that, just love it, because we have become so arrogant in their perception, and maybe for real, that they're just looking for someone to take us down, not just a peg or two, but 4 or 5 pegs, and beyond that.
You see,
and,
I would say
that's not going to change, Mike.
I would say, Ted, that we are not. Most reporters are not arrogant. Most reporters are looking for a story.
You misunderstand. I'm not
I
talking about...
don't think I did.
I think you do. I'm not just talking about reporters. I'm talking about...
Anchormen?
The establishment. And it, you know, we simply
That's a
are...
cliche.
We're a part of that establishment. They don't like Congress. They don't like the courts. They don't like the FBI. They don't like the intelligence agencies. And Trump has done an absolutely brilliant job of focusing, and we're merely part of that establishment, more visible perhaps, in their homes every day. But it's that which gives so much staying power to depicting the press as being an enemy of the people.
It's grievance politics. It's a conservative victimhood complex that is in effect that we are seeing. I think of Fox News, part of which, I watch Fox News all the time. I compete with Fox News. A lot of its programming is about resentment and rage, some of the things you're describing, against the establishment, even though they're multi-million-dollar stars that are evidence of an elite in this country. But I would have to say, going back to Spiro Agnew, we're still here. We're still standing. Right? It is worth noting that a lot of news outlets have seen growth in subscriptions, that at least some parts of the country actually trust the press more than they did a few years ago. It's unfortunately just created more of a divide between those who believe the New York Times and those who hate the New York Times.
David, Trump has introduced the concept of the press being the enemy of the people. That was not used in a democracy up to this point. And I'm wondering, is it possible that that is going to be the projection of the relationship between the president and the press for a long time to come? Or is it possible, in your view, that when Trump goes, whenever that be, that we're going to go back to something more normal than what it is that we're experiencing today? Or is he going to leave something there? What is your sense?
So let me say this. Prognostication is for suckers, and apparently tonight I am that sucker. So I would say the following. I don't believe that the next president, whether it's Mike Pence or Mitt Romney or Elizabeth Warren or Cory Booker or whomever, that it will be the same thing. I don't think that it will be that the press is the enemy of the people in that way. I think that Trump will have succeeded in moving the press farther down the spectrum toward that a bit. His center of gravity will have been pulled that way, and it will have tainted the waters. But I don't think it'll be the enemy of people. I mean, remember, what he's really saying is that the press is the enemy of the president, and he's conflating rhetorically the presidency with the people. Now, I don't accept the idea that the press is the enemy of the president either. I think the press is performing sometimes admirably, sometimes with hyperventilation, the role of providing a check on power and providing some form of accountability. But I think that that's what's going on. I don't think this can sustain. The word crisis was invoked earlier, and I hadn't realized, but I think it's legitimate to ask the question, is there a crisis for journalism? I thought you'd meant the sort of pH or where the nation was resting. And I would say for the first 6 months, at least of the presidency, maybe longer, of this presidency, there was a sense of crisis, but a manufactured one, an unnecessary one. We were not going to new wars. We were not in huge financial crisis. The unemployment, there are problems in the country to address, but the nation was fundamentally working. But there was a manufactured sense of crisis.
By
there
whom?
were from this administration. There was set in rapid succession of series of policies that the public, and that for that matter, the administration did not seem ready to effectively implement. And so the press was running around trying to get information. People were having their lives dislocated. There was chaos at airports. I mean, there are all kinds of stuff happening. And that, I think, fostered further the sense that somehow there was this clash between the press and the president in a way that I think in a different era I think Trump is a fairly singular figure. Now, as I said, it's a game for suckers. And, some years from now, someone else will be inaugurated who will have been a superhero in one of these, franchise movies from Marvel, and I'll be proven entirely wrong. But that is my sense.
Okay. I'd like to widen the scope here just a bit. A very good reporter named John Meacham did a book in the early to mid part of 2018 called The Soul of America. Mm-hmm. In that book, he took the approach to American history of saying that the period that we're in right now is a very difficult period, and he acknowledges that. But he says that we have had many difficult periods in our history, and he starts back at the Civil War and goes into World War I and goes into a number of areas where the country was confronted by a very major challenge and somehow came out of it just fine. On the other side of that was a book done by the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. That book was called Fascism. Mm-hmm. And in that book, she takes the view that she wanted very much to agree with the Meacham view. She wanted to believe that all is going to be fine at a certain point. But she wasn't sure. And she went back to the 1930s and even into the 1920s and went back into Italian history and German history and the rise of Hitler. And there was a sophisticated Western, highly industrialized nation, very intelligent people, and they went wild and under fascism did some horrific things. So she is saying, simply as raising a question, does it follow that because we have come through difficult times before, we will once again emerge from this difficult time into better times, and the sun will again be shining on America, and all will be well? And I think that is a legitimate question of which the media is simply one manifestation of that larger problem. And I'm wondering, starting with Ted, just go around and have a chat about this, whether Meacham makes more sense to you than Madeleine Albright, and then we can go on from there. Go ahead.
Meacham makes a lot of sense, and I like John a lot, and I agree with you. He's a great journalist and a fine scholar. I think, however, that the internet has changed certain fundamental things forever. And what it has changed forever is the capacity of individuals to communicate with vast numbers of people. And tragically, what gains the most attention tends to be the most outrageous material. We've always had haters out there. We've always had people who try to spread hatred, but we've never had the capacity to disseminate it as efficiently as we do now. That's a genie we can't put back in the bottle again. And so I fear that on a certain level, things will get better after we have a less inflammatory president in the White House. But they're never going to go back to the way they were.
Emily, what would be your take?
I'm going to agree with that. I think I might tend a little bit more toward Madeleine Albright's take on this, but I mean, we've heard a lot about incivility. Incivility has been sanctioned by our president. He promotes it. That's what he does. That's what he festers every day. And we've all picked up on that. It's not going to change. And he did that with, well, through the internet, through tweeting originally, but he does it verbally. He does it on television. That's what he does all day long. That's what his tweets are intended to hurt people. And people are enabled by that. I think I pay attention to a lot of news coverage in my local community in Boston. There's no question there's been an uptick in every single kind of, from graffiti to anti-Semitism. We read about it every day now in the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald. That has been sanctioned. It's okayed by our president. And will that go away? It will certainly be diminished with his departure, but I'm not sure it'll ever go away.
Brian?
You know, everyone trusts some form of media. We hear that trust in media is low, and it is. But everyone trusts some form of media. It's just that some Americans trust CNN and others trust Alex Jones. We need to advocate for ourselves to persuade as many people as we can to trust real news outlets and not conspiracy theorists. I'm not trying to make a plug for my show, but I always go back to the name Reliable Sources, because in an age where everybody's a source, where every person on Twitter is a source, or where every politician's a source, we have to help people figure out what's reliable. And I think we've seen that in large part in the Trump era, trying to guide people through through stormy seas and help them understand what's reliable. But it is difficult, and journalists also have to fess up about the mistakes that we make along that way. I think that I liked David's prediction about a possible superhero president from Hollywood. I kind of think every president from here on out is going to have television star power. Like it or not, love it or hate it, they're going to have to be television stars. Trump has shown that. And I don't know what kind of television star we're going to get next, but hopefully we can rebuild a little bit of the trust between the presidency and the press, even though it always has to be adversarial and always should be adversarial. That is a good thing.
We've only got about a minute to go, and I'd like very quickly for just to raise something sort of on the positive side.
Yeah.
As I look around the audience, I can see young people, and some of them want, I think, to be journalists. Do you think, given all of the problems of journalism today, quickly, Ted, do you think they should go into journalism or become dentists?
I go back to your Richard C. Hotlet quote. Get it straight. Become journalists, but be professional journalists. I hate the self-depiction of some of our colleagues as being part of the resistance. No, we're not. We're journalists, and that means gathering the facts and conveying them as accurately as we can. Sometimes that will be hypercritical, but we got to do it.
David, quickly.
I think it's tremendous. I wouldn't be still doing it if I didn't think it was worth doing. I think that the financial underpinnings are really rough right now, and there's a kind of celebrification at the top. But I think if it's something you believe in, it is absolutely vital for our democracy to function.
Emily?
Don't lament the past, embrace the future. It's still the greatest job in the world. And there's so many more opportunities out there now than there were when we all started.
And the young journalists can help us improve this climate. They can help restore trust. Besides, I mean, what's more fun than a deadline? The greatest inspiration is a deadline.
I tell you, my advice too, for whatever it's worth, is stay with journalism. Remember that fourth estate that they used to talk about, the writers, the commentators, the dissidents? Their job was to tell us what's happening, who's telling us the truth, who's lying. I know from more than 60 years in this business that when we have a free press, we have an excellent chance of retaining our democracy. The press is not the enemy of the people, no matter what the president says. It is our best guarantor of freedom and democracy. And that's it for now. Let me thank our audience here at the National Press Club and people who pick up this program all over the world. But let me also thank our panel of journalists for sharing their time, their insights, and their perspective on the current crisis in president-press relations. Ted Koppel, David Folkenflik, Emily Rooney, Brian Stelter. And that's it for now. I'm Marvin Kalb, and as Ed Murrow used to say many years ago, good night and good luck.
Right.
Okay, what we have now is 20 minutes of you, the panel, and people standing up behind the camera. I will recognize you. Please give me your name, what you're associated with, and then ask a question. If you make a speech, I'll cut you off. I'm alerting you now. Who goes first on the right?
My name is Kammi Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is about media's given true picture. Economy is doing very well. Iran doesn't threat America anymore. A country like Mexico, Canada, China, they are ready to renegotiate international trade contract favorable to American condition. Why doesn't American media write about these things? If you open Washington Post, there would be only one journalist who would be writing in the favor of Trump, and he used to work for Senator Jesse Holmes, and now he is with the American Enterprise.
What is the question,
so
please?
90% journalists are writing against Trump. So I mean, what Trump...
is your question, please?
So my question is, why doesn't media give positive things what Trump is doing for this country? So
Okay, thank you very much. Brian, you can go.
How did you hear about those things?
From internet, not from you guys.
Where do you think the internet got it?
Journalists are writing the stories that you're reading. And you may not realize that they're...
Against Trump. They are enemy of Trump, and it's... I mean,
No, this is not a debate. You've had your question, and I thank you very much. We're moving on. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. What's the question over here, please?
Hello, my name is Ann Lyko, and I'm a member of the Press Club. And Trump has been an expert at propaganda and saying the same thing over and over again and trying to sow dissension. Margaret Sullivan of the Post wrote a really good column a couple of months ago, and I'm going to just propose it because you're sort of talking around the same idea, is that the mainstream media amplifies the propaganda, all the bright, shiny stuff, and doesn't spend as much time as it should really going after the story instead of repeating all the outrageous things that he's saying. And my question is there a way, if you start thinking about not letting him manipulate the press's agenda, but to actually do, I think it was said that NPR sort of did this, going after the stories, the wide varieties, and changing the public dialogue and lowering the heat on the stuff that's stirring us up.
Yep, thank you. Thank you for that question. David, you want to pick that up?
I mean, it's consistent, I think, with what I was suggesting earlier, with the idea that I think presidential rhetoric is important. I've become, over the years, only last 21 years covering politics and media, that it really is an important part of the job, and we have to cover it. We have to cover it with context. We can't cover it unalloyed and uncorrected without context. But we also have to make sure that that's not the only dominant story we cover. There's so much that this government does every day, for good and for ill, affecting hundreds of millions of Americans, people all around the world. We have to cover the policies. We have to cover the implications of what's being done and not just the rhetoric around it. And I think that that's a huge thing.
If I may, David, and I think it also gets to the point that this gentleman was making. The Washington Post today had a story which said, in effect, that it is now U.S. policy to remain in Syria until the Iranians are driven out. That's a gigantic change in American policy. It is one that is going to affect the lives of however many young Americans we end up sending over to Syria. Brian, forgive me, I've not been watching CNN today. Was that a big story on CNN?
It may have been, but I have not heard it until you said it.
No, I haven't either. And I certainly didn't see it on MSNBC.
Yep.
And I didn't see it on the evening news.
So there is an example, Ted, of a very good story, an important story that appears in a major daily newspaper.
Major daily newspaper, but it was like on page 12 and not picked up by cable and not picked up by the broadcast media. I mean, what I'm saying is we have become so obsessed with every aspect of the Trump story that there are a lot of really important things going on that we're not doing.
And even on places like the Post, which I think is in many ways does a crackerjack job, it often has 4 or 5 bites at the apple of the same story, and 3 of those will be among the top 5 stories that day. So that the Post is playing to that, even as it does excellent accountability journalism and covers these important stories from abroad and far-flung places, as well as places around the country. But it's also playing to that in part because its readers are clicking on that.
But I just want to jump in because something you said earlier, Ted, about the money. If they're not covering Trump, then they're spending inordinate amounts of time on stories like that missing 6-year-old autistic boy or Molly Tibbetts out in the Midwest. It's things that drive people's emotions, that they get wrapped up in it, and then they turn on to see, did they find that kid yet? And so, or a hurricane, anything that's going to just drive you to
Emily, you're exactly right. But if we want to be respected as really being committed to everything that Marvin has been talking about, we've got to resist that pull. I'm not saying don't cover the Trump story. I'm just saying don't make it 70% of what we cover. And I fear that's what we're doing these days.
But it's not going to be, what I'm saying is it's not going to be Syria. It's going to be the autistic kid. They're not going to substitute.
We need to teach folks to find the Syria story.
Yeah.
I mean that. I think we have to train that this is a media literacy issue, to understand that every story in the whole world is at your fingertips, but you have to find it. And we might hate that, but that is the reality of this world. You have to go find it yourself.
Also, Trump's America First policy makes stories like that much less important. It's Syria, it's Pakistan, nobody cares about that. And he has inspired people to believe that.
Yeah, but Emily, you know something? If we do the story in terms of, folks, your sons and daughters may very likely be sitting in Syria for the next 20 years. This may be leading to a war with Iran. There are ways, there is no such thing as a really dull story if it's properly done.
If you were doing Nightline, you'd have done it.
Well, if I were doing that, look.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Tim. I live in the area. I'm a structural engineer. My question is, was it journalists nowadays who work on blogs are under a lot of pressure, both professionally and financially, to publish several articles a day and maximize the number of page views? Do you think this has created an environment where it's easy for sensationalized or not well-researched stories or even fake stories to infiltrate the news cycle?
You want to try?
Are you saying because they're not paid?
Oh, no, it's that they need to get a maximum number of page views.
Oh, I see.
Or...
And also they're not paid.
Yeah.
David, you want to try?
Sure. Yes. I think I think there are excellent bloggers out there, and I think there are also bloggers who feel, even at major news organizations, who are paid to post repeatedly throughout the day, and they feel great pressure to get out stories. It's often derivative. Maybe they're doing some aggregation and they're rounding up things, but yeah, and I think that there's an art to producing a headline that makes you click, or a link that draws you to want to share it before you've even read it. And some of that involves, can involve distortion or manipulating some of the emphases there, the context, and I think it short circuits what we're doing. I mean, it's sort of a different example. Sometimes cable news, not Brian's show, but sometimes cable news will do that.
I don't like cable news sometimes either, okay?
I'm just saying, I don't want to make it sound like bloggers are the only folks who do this. Cable will chew on the same topic for 40 minutes of an hour and leave another 10, 15 for other things. And in order to talk 40 minutes about the same things, you've got to indicate that the stakes are apocalyptic at all time, no matter how big or small the story is. That's the way that works. And so we're in a time where both online and on the air, there's this pressure to do that.
Can I just add that misinformation has been profitable for the past few years because of Facebook, because of Google. It's easy to create a blog, put up some lies. I had a story written about me. The first paragraph was true, the rest was fake, and I could barely tell what was real and what was untrue. How are they supposed to know what's real and what's not real? Facebook and Google are trying to do better, right? Trying to clean this up. But the internet has atomized everything so that the New York Times and resistance.com are the same thing, and that is a fundamental problem. We need to promote and encourage folks to find high quality news, and I want to be optimistic here. I was in Texas over the weekend at the Texas Tribune Festival. It's a nonprofit news outlet. It holds a conference. Thousands of people come. They raise $2.8 million in a weekend for journalism. So there are ways to create these new business models for news, but we need folks to buy in and hopefully subscribe.
Yes, please, over here.
Yes, Lincoln Smith, and I'm a retired Navy Public Affairs officer and radio broadcaster, member here of the National Press Club. And I've got two questions, the first of which is directed at Mr. Koppel. Sir, you spoke about the two challenges we have before us, the ability now of the President to, in an unprecedented way, communicate directly with the American people and the Internet. Here's my question. What do you see the future of local radio, knowing it's been cut so much over the past few decades, being where we get back to that local radio station that really knows the personalities and the people in City Hall? Do you see local radio as part of the solution in the future to those two challenges? And my other question...
Thank you, sir. That one question will do. Thank you. Ted?
Local radio can't be the solution to that problem. And the problem with local radio is that it too has to make money. Someone has to be prepared to support it. Local radio can't be a substitute. I agree with what I think is the premise of your question. We desperately need to have news agencies of all kind operating on a local level, covering local stories. As you probably know, local radio stations are going out of business. Local television stations are being absorbed by huge outfits like Sinclair Broadcasting. None of that is good for the actual dissemination of news. But I take your point.
Let me just offer one thing for the home team here.
Yeah.
Local public radio
Yes.
is often, as Emily can attest as well, is often stepping up and expanding, increasing its ambitions as newspapers are constricting theirs. So it's a different model
And
than
has doubled its
commercial radio.
audience in the past
But its
year.
audiences are actually quite significant.
Yeah.
In many markets, it's the top radio station in the region. And it's doing real and often muscular journalism. I think the ambitions are expanding there, even as you're seeing the collapse of original reporting in commercial radio.
No, I stand
Muscular
corrected.
journalism. I like that
Absolutely.
phrase.
No,
Yes, please.
Yep.
Next question.
Hello, my name is Ashish Patel. I'm an independent healthcare journalist from Houston. So, as you were saying, the internet has pulled the genie out of the bottle. It's very difficult to tamp that down.
Would you speak into the microphone?
Sorry.
I may be the only one missing.
As you were saying earlier, the genie has let folks publish any kind of partially false news and publish that broadly for clickbait and disseminate that very quickly. But then you also see resources like PolitiFact being able to eliminate or at least defilter or remove from search results some portion of that. Facebook has got a very large compliance team. Google also has brought in thousands of people in their compliance team. So the question is, do you think resources like PolitiFact could be adopted unilaterally across the journalism organizations? And do you think that could ease the tension between politicians and journalists?
Thank you for that.
No.
You don't think so?
No, No, because they have the same problem that every credible news organization has, that they're going to be disbelieved. You remember about a year ago this time, I think, Stephen Brill, who started Court TV, and he announced that he was going to be the aggregator of everything that was fake news and real news, and he was going to be the one to just put it out there and tell you what was real and what wasn't. You seen that recently?
Yeah. No.
Right, exactly. I mean, even if he had done it, and he's got a lot of credibility himself, people wouldn't believe it. And this whole political thing, people parse that out to the point where there's some things that are obviously true and obviously false, but then the nuances of what anything can be said about either it's a policy or a personality or how somebody spoke, it all becomes subjective.
Next question, please.
Hi, my name is Jason Pico. I'm from Washington, D.C. My question is, you talked about sort of after Trump and things settling down, and coverage of Trump is like an OxyContin habit. How does the media stop? Because he is certainly not going to go quietly into the night after he's president, after he leaves the Oval Office. So how is that broken? How does the press get into rehab to not be addicted to Mr. Trump anymore?
I think it's a very good reminder that depending on how this presidency ends, he may well have a show on Fox News, or he may have a channel on the internet where he's constantly talking. And that'll require constant editorial judgment about whether what this former president says is newsworthy or not. It's similar to the problem articulated earlier about his tweets. And David, you were talking about this issue. I think early on in the presidency, there was an overreaction to certain tweets, and I was guilty of that. You would jump at every tweet. You would go on TV and talk about every tweet. I think there's been a better dialing of that, a dialing down of that now, to some degree, where there's not always an overreaction to every tweet. I think the same would have to be true in a post-presidency. What is newsworthy, what is not? But I think we should be, we have no idea how this ends. This could end 18 different ways. And depending on how it ends, that'll determine how much he is covered in the post-presidency. It's just it's a complete unknowable for now.
But let me add a postscript to that. If indeed he is impeached, and if he is convicted, if that's how it ends, he becomes bigger than ever.
Ooh,
in terms of communication.
I was trying to imply that this is if this is Nixon again, then he goes away.
I know you would.
But the
way it works is this. Right now, you've got to imagine that people at various networks are already game planning for when he leaves office in a couple of years, or in 6 years, or in 6 weeks, or whatever it is, and they're figuring out, what reality show does he get, right? And how do we define it? It's the ex-presidents of Bedminster, New Jersey, or whatever the title of the show is.
I like it.
Yeah.
I've reserved the URL on that, but so then the question is how long? You've got the lights and you've got the camera crews on there, and the question will be how long the show is actually broadcast. Because I think as long as people are taping him, and he's able to talk in front of the Kliegel legs, it almost doesn't matter if the show's broadcast anymore. But the post-presidency, will be televised, I think, is what we know. And other than that,
I don't think it's just an addiction we have to Trump, though. Trump is about race and class and gender in America. This is about what our country is. And when we're talking about Trump, we're actually really talking about what is our country. So I think that's the addiction. There is an addiction to that debate, to that fight, to that conflict, because effectively he creates conflict wherever he goes. But it's not just Trump. I would just add that caveat.
Okay, we've got time, and I apologize for those who are waiting in line and won't have an opportunity to ask a question, because we've only got time for this last question. Over here, please.
Yes, my name is Dashan Farad. I'm a reporter for YourBlackWorld.com, and my question is directed at Mr. Koppel, but anyone is free to answer it. We in black media view the Trump presidency as being racially polarizing and increasingly hostile towards black and brown people. What I would like to know, what can we in the press in general do to combat this administration, which Michael Eric Dyson has referred to as white supremacy on steroids?
Well, you raise a dreadfully important and difficult issue, because I think what you want to hear me say is we have to mobilize against it. I'm going to say the same thing I've been saying all evening long. We have to do our jobs objectively, cleanly. If we start to fight this on the basis, I mean, what will happen after the Trump presidency? The resistance will switch, that's all.
Yes,
You'll
true.
get a different resistance. That's not an appropriate place for us to be. That's a good place for the editorial and op-ed pages of our major newspapers to be. That's not what should be appearing on the front page. That's not what should be appearing in your newscasts on CNN. Just shouldn't. And as long as we do, you're going to have a terribly bifurcated nation.
A wonderful way of wrapping up the evening. Thank you, Ted, David, Emily, Brian, and thank you all for being here, and let us thank our panelists for being a terrific job. Thank you all very much. Good job. Good job.